When anyone speaks about the state of an economy, you're confronted right at the beginning, if you're honest, with an immense array of statistical information. It's a little bit like going to the doctor and saying you want an overview of how good your health really is. If the doctor is honest, the doctor will tell you, well, there's a million measurements I could take. Your blood, your stamina, your lymph nodes. I mean, it's an immense array. And you put yourself in the hands of a doctor. You want the doctor's judgment. What are the key variables to look at? And how do you balance what each one of those variables tells you? At any given moment, the human body has things in it that are going in a direction that is not good. And there are things in it which are doing well and are doing fine. And you need the judgment of the doctor to give you a sense of where it nets out. Well, I'm in the same position. And I say that because I want you to know that the level of inequality in society is an extremely important and significant variable in the way I look at the economy, but it differs from other economists who range from people who give it no importance to people who give it a little and a little more and so on. But I give it a lot. Therefore, I'm here to say that contrary to the clip you just showed, we weren't making improvements that were then disrupted by the pandemic. Sure, the line is not a straight line, it wobbles around. But the direction has been the same for the last 35 years, namely growing inequality. If you did a look comparing the United States with Western Europe at the end of World War II, you would have seen that the United States was a less unequal economy in terms of the ratio of rich people to the middle to the bottom. And we are now way number one. We have shot ahead of all the other European countries to become one of the most unequal economies in the world. That has been true across Republican and Democratic presidencies, Republican and Democratic Congresses, policy changes of this sort and that. But one of the most stunning constants has been the relentless worsening of the inequality. And I would argue that that reality is deeply affecting, or maybe I should use the word infecting, the rest of the economy. There's no getting away from it. I see it as a professor teaching my classes. My students are very anxious about the future. They do not believe the way I did when I went through the university that I might not get the job of my dreams, but by going to the university and getting my degree, I was sure of a decent job, a decent income. I could get married. I could think about having children, all of that. My students today, and I teach in a perfectly normal, average university situation here in New York City where I live and work, and my students are light years from that perception. They do not expect to get a very good job at all. They expect to cobble together a little thing over here and a little thing over there to live in a fundamental condition of precarity. And I think what you're seeing is the reflection of the fact that we have a very, very insecure job market. Companies have been outsourcing, relocating jobs out of the country. They have been bringing immigrants in to replace American workers, American-born workers, and they've been continuing automation. I mean, my students' mentality is we're all about to, and this is a joke, but you know, you don't have to be a Freudian to understand what the joke is telling you. The joke is AI is eating our future, and we are going to have to survive in an environment that does that. And I think the truth of it is that corporations are investing in AI. Whether that's a reasonable decision, that's another matter. I'm not so sure at all. But they are, and they're pumping money into AI, and they are resisting Mr. Trump's efforts to reshape the global economy. The bottom line is the job situation is both fluid and negative in terms of how people are reacting to it. And I think those statistics reflect all of that. Finally, there's a particular factor, but I don't want to get lost in that. The pandemic was a tremendous shock to the American working class on many levels. But one of them was not wanting to have the kind of work life that they had had before, finding that return to their job wasn't really feasible, discovering that their employer had taken the advantage of the pandemic to try very hard to get 4 people to do what they used to have 6 people doing, that the conditions of their work were different. They then quit their job, they look for something else, they don't find it. And if I really had time, I would talk to you also about the immense explosion of illegal or off the grid, might be a better way to put it, jobs that young people are increasingly taking, which also impact those statistics that you see in the chart.
There are cracks showing up in the labor force, which we can talk about in more detail. Fed Chair Jerome Powell highlighted some of these concerns at the Jackson Hole Symposium last week. However, if you take a look at what's being released this week, GDP numbers for the latest quarter came out. The last quarter increased at 3.3% annualized. And this is the second estimate from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, released Thursday, August 28th. And the initial reported consensus expectation was only 3%. And so GDP growth, real GDP actually came in a little bit higher than expected. It seems to me that there are somewhat conflicting signals. On the one hand, perhaps we've got a slowdown in labor growth. We've got, like we've talked about earlier, a rising inequality and the lower income households not gaining anything in terms of wage growth. But on the other hand, the economy overall is growing faster than expected. What do you make of this divergence?
The government is injecting, if you read the details, $9 billion of our tax money is being handed over to the board of directors of Intel to use as they see fit. Wonderful for them. They now have money with which to try to fix that company, which, by the way, needs fixing. Its stock price is low, it has had problems, etc., etc. So now let's try to understand. If you're a difficult company, you're not going to figure out necessarily how to improve your technology, how to get a new market. There's another way to solve your problem. Go to Mr. Trump, who has just invited you. Come so I can make a deal. Let me give you a second example. When a union strikes, when the union at Intel, it has 100,000 workers. When the union strikes, it will be striking the government. Will Mr. Trump call out the army the way he is against the cities of Chicago, New York, LA, DC? Are we going to see more and less government ownership? Will Mr. Trump start firing people on the board the way he is at the Fed? Because the share the government has is a dominant share. Whether they have a seat on the board or not is friggin' irrelevant. They will have the power that goes with it. If you don't do what the government wants, it'll sell those shares. And that will depress the price of your stock right into the toilet, and you will not be able to function. And you're the CEO, you'll know it. You know what's happening? The fascistic merger of the corporate and the political party top, and we're all watching what is going to be a very dangerous day.
You call this fascist, but how is this fundamentally different from what China has been doing for the last many decades? How is this different from, let's say, Canada, for example, which has state-owned pension funds investing large numbers of shares in public companies, for example?
It's a very, very good question. If the company is continuing to use the basic capitalist structure, the division of the people in an enterprise between the employers who run it and the employees who do the work, then we call that state capitalism. The government is becoming an employer, and the employer is becoming the government. Does that exist in other societies? Absolutely. In some more, in some less. One of the differences, though, if you want to look at China, is what is the use or the purpose of doing this? In the third world, what we used to call the third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, the official, the ostensible, the reason they give, and that's more or less true, is to raise their societies out of the poverty that is their number one goal. So they mobilize their resources. China is a perfect example. They divided their country roughly in half. Half of it is private enterprises, and half of it is government enterprises. And they all use the employer-employee capitalist model. But China's number one boast is it lifted 800 million people out of poverty in the last 25 years. Notice what Mr. Trump says. Is this a way to really help the mass of the American people? Not at all. He says right away, it's going to make us richer. The stocks went up. Yeah, that's the point. It's not that there isn't a similarity. It's what is used to do. Here it is used, and we go back to the beginning of our talk today, it's used to deepen the inequality of our society. Otherwise, you wouldn't help Intel with $9 billion. You know what you'd use the $9 billion for? To help the people at the bottom. That would lift them up. And by the way, the money you give them at the bottom, they would spend. And what would they spend it on? The goods and services capitalists produce. You know what you might call that? Trickle-up economics. It's the alternative to trickle down. Fascism is when you organize the economies to make those in charge even richer than they would have been without it. And you then assert, Mr. Trump isn't smart enough to do this, but you then assert, it's good that we do it, it'll trickle down. It will mean jobs in America. If you know what Intel is, you will know that it is a highly capitalized enterprise. It will not produce very many jobs, and there are dozens of ways to use the same amount of money to produce way more jobs than giving it to Intel will ever generate.
On your trickle-up philosophy, how would giving money to the lowest wage earners help invigorate the economy?
Here's how it works. You take your $9 billion, you give it to Intel. The first thing Intel does, shareholders, is take a number of steps to improve the salary packages for their top executives. The second thing they do is take a number of steps to improve the dividends they pay to their shareholders to keep them happy. The last thing they do is give money to their employees. You could take the $9 billion. Why don't you short-circuit the process? Give it directly to the employees. You know what then happens? They spend every nickel because they're poor. They don't have any money to save. They can't meet their needs as it is. That's why you help them. And you get the benefit, which all economics teaches, that if you give money to poor people, they spend it. And if you give money to rich people, they don't.
If you give money to the poor people, they would quit their jobs, and this is just a theory, they would quit their jobs and Intel wouldn't have any employees to run the business, and the business would collapse. How would you respond to that theory?
You give them a pay for a job. If that's your problem, give them the job that they want. We have, 10 million people, conservatively estimated, 10 million people without a job. Create 10 million jobs, make them pay well. These people will be beating. I'll introduce you to my students. They'll be lined up to get these decent jobs that are secure government jobs. That's what they want. They will come and they will respond, and they will spend every nickel, and that'll give much more of a boost to the economy, that trickling up, than giving it to the richest people in America, the corporate executives who we know spend their time figuring out how to, quote, save on labor costs, because it's what makes your business more profitable. That's not what we need. What Mr. Trump is doing is giving it to them, because he's them and they're him. But that's not the solution to our problem. And in the end, The growing problems of this society will undo Mr. Trump long before he will undo them. We are highly likely to have a recession. I know from a whole lifetime of watching the economy that no one can predict exactly when the next recession comes. No one can predict how bad it'll be, and no one can predict how long it'll last. Let me remind everyone of what the National Bureau of Economic Research, an agency of the United States government, partly private, partly governmental, keeps track of these ups and downs. Our capitalist system that we live in is very unstable. What that means is every 4 to 7 years, and that's what we know, having looked at it, it has a crash. We have a lot of words for that. Recession, depression, boom and bust, crash, crisis, downturn, upturn. The instability is baked in to the system we live with. You ought to wonder yourself whether we ought to be accepting it. A lot of efforts have been made over the centuries to try to do something to get rid of that instability. But so far, capitalism has not found a way to do that. Well, let's take a look at this century, the 21st century. We had a crash in the spring of the year 2000. It had a name, the dot-com crash. Then we had another one in the year 2008. 7 to 8 years later, right? That's the average. That was called the subprime mortgage crash. And then in 2020, again, you see not 4 to 7, a bit longer. Remember, 4 to 7 is an average. There's some longer, there's some shorter. And so in 2020, we had one, we gave it a special name. We called it the COVID crash of 2020. And here we are, 5 years later. 5 is a number that comes between 4 and 7. That's the average. So we're now readying for the next one. We don't know exactly when it'll happen. We don't know how long it'll last. And we don't know how bad it'll be. But we're due. And we have never escaped from them in the past. That's why we call the system unstable. That's why the National Bureau of Economic Research tells us it's a 4 to 7 year average, because they have so many examples to look at and with which to calculate that average. So yeah, I think we're going to face, and we're going to have it, and it's going to possibly be very, very bad. The tariff is a tax. It is a tax that a country puts on goods and services that are produced outside the country, but that come into the country where they are finally sold and consumed by whoever buys them. So what you're doing is applying a tax when an externally produced good or service crosses your border into your country. Tariffs are hundreds and hundreds of years old. There's nothing new, there's nothing original, there's nothing exceptional about a country applying tariffs. Therefore, there's an immense literature in every decent library full of books and articles that explain how tariffs work, what their goals are, and a good literature examining when they did and when they didn't achieve the goals that were set for them. So we know all of that. And here's the simple conclusion of all that literature, which I, as a professor of economics all my life, have had to teach to generations of students. Number one, you don't know when you impose a tariff what its results will be. You know, it's a little bit like raising an interest rate or changing the value of your currency or any other kind of important economic change. It can go this way or it can go that way, and it depends on the context and the other things going on, what the effect of a tariff or any of these other things will be. So when you hear either Mr. Trump or any of his economic advisors telling you we're putting on a tariff because it's going to have this particular result, my politest way of responding is you'd be better off talking to somebody else. because this is a person who is telling you something they cannot know. Okay, now let's be concrete about what is going on in the U.S. right now. Mr. Trump, in order to look like he's the big, powerful leader who's going to bring us, just like your clip said, riches beyond imagination, and all the rest of that kind of talk, he is levying tariffs on our neighbors to the north and south, Mexico and Canada, on our European, I was about to say allies, but that's not so clear anymore, and on all the dirty 15 and all the rest that are being talked about. And that's going to mean that if you buy something from Canada or Mexico or Europe or any of the others that have a tariff, you're going to have to pay more money. You're going to have to buy the object and pay whatever it costs, plus the tariff, which is a tax imposed by the United States on these goods and services coming in, which will be charged to you, the buyer, and that money you pay will go to Uncle Sam. So, for example, you'll have to pay $20,000 for a motor scooter made in Italy, say, and if it's got a tariff, an additional, I don't know, $1,000, $5,000, depends how high they set the tariff, that'll go to Uncle Sam. So you'll be out more money. Now, let's take a look at that. Right there, before we take another step, here's the logic. A tariff will raise the prices of the goods that are affected by the tariff. If we're not going to bring in avocados from Mexico, because that's where most of them come from, without a tariff now, if we're going to put a tariff on them, that's the threat. Well, then your avocado, however you eat it, is going to cost you more. Long story short, it's going to worsen the inflation. Wow, that's serious. Do we know in advance that that's going to happen? No, it could be offset by something else. If, for example, the cost of oil and gas were to collapse and we were to suddenly go back to $2 a gallon to fill our car at the same time that we impose tariffs, then the one would offset the other and there might not be an inflation. Is that possible? Yeah. Is it likely that oil and gas prices are going to collapse? No. Which means it's probably going to be inflationary. And I could go on and on and on. But there is something about the tariff program of Mr. Trump where we can know in advance what the result is. Here is the one example. If you impose a tariff, but you leave the impression on people that the tariff might not last that long, that the tariff might be raised or lowered in the near or even medium future, then you are doing something very dangerous. Why am I telling you this? Because Mr. Trump has been doing that. He's imposed a tariff, then he's taken it away. He's imposed a large one. Then he said he's going to do instead a small one. It's not clear if they're going to last for a few months or a few years or indefinitely. That is important for the simple following reason. Every large corporation that either does business abroad, which is most large American corporations do that, or even if it doesn't, but it depends on buying things from abroad or selling things from abroad and so on, they have to calculate, should we invest, for example, if we're doing well in a new factory? If you're doing well, hopefully, this is the kind of question your executives face. But now with Mr. Trump, here's what's happening. They're not investing because they can't decide where. Two of the largest Japanese companies that make automobiles, I won't mention their names, but you all know them, have just informed the Mexican government that the plans they had told them they were going to build more Japanese automobile factories in Mexico. There already are a bunch. Almost every automobile company does something in Mexico, but they just announced they're not making the investment for the time being. They may in the future, but they're holding back. Why? Because they know it makes no sense for them to invest in a car company in Mexico on the hope that they could sell those cars in the United States without paying a tariff, because there isn't one now, and there hasn't been one between the United States and Mexico for many years. Now they don't know. They don't know where to put it. Maybe they should build it in Texas. Maybe they should build it in a third country. Maybe they should stay home in Japan, build it there. Here's what's happened. Many companies have already announced very clearly, because they have no reason to hide it, that because of the uncertainty within which the whole tariff conversation is discussed, they're holding back. And the way capitalism works, if the corporate sector holds back investment, means it's not hiring the workers it might otherwise have hired. It's not buying the goods and services it would have had to buy if it had made the investment. And so suddenly the demand for people, the demand for goods and services falls down, and we get what's called a recession. That's why you hear all the talk of recession now. The fault and the blame goes first to the corporate executives who make the decision to invest or not, here or there. You know, we are all, let's remember, we are all held hostage. If you live in a capitalist system, we are all held hostage for our jobs, our incomes, and everything else by the decision of the tiny minority of top executives who make all the investment choices that we have to live with. And what Mr. Trump, his fault is that he's making life so uncertain for them, forget about us, for them, that they're reacting in the way they normally do. And so all of us are wondering whether we're going to have a recession and how badly it's going to affect you, me, your family, my family, our town, your community, and so on. I don't want people to believe that there's no way out or that we're trapped. Not at all. I want to understand where we really are. I think there are all kinds of ways that the United States, which remains a rich, powerful country with an awful lot of well-educated, smart, thoughtful people, a strong working class, we have a lot of resources at our disposal. We are not in a desperate position. We are desperate if you want to keep the empire going. That's over. And that will show you all kinds of desperate efforts, because that's a long shot. But if we stop that, if we actually mobilize the resources that we possess as a nation, then everybody else in the world will sit down and work something out. They will, because the rest of the world is frightened now by what is happening in and by and from the United States. Don't dismiss the shaking heads of the leaders of Mexico and Canada. They don't want to be at the receiving end of what looks to them to be hostile, strange, aberrant, desperate behavior. If Canada cannot sell its gas and oil to the United States, it'll probably sell it to China. Really? That's what happens when you go down. You flail and you hurt others, and it comes back to hurt you. We don't need to do that. We shouldn't do that. We are entertaining politicians who think that's what we want to hear and see. Let's make it clear to them, no, that's not what we want. That's not a solution. That actually makes the problem worse. I actually believe, but I'm happy to be shown to be wrong, that most of the rest of the world, including Russia, China, and others, are more than willing to sit down. We will have our differences. We will have to negotiate. In order to get what we need, we'll have to give stuff up. Sure, but what's the real alternative? Not the make-believe alternative, not the big bloviating, none of that. Stop. That's a dead end in all the meanings of that term.